All right, biology students, we are in lesson 2 of our evolution unit. Today's focus is on natural selection. If for some reason you've not already watched video 1 or lesson 1 in our evolution unit, head over and watch that introduction to evolution unit and then join us back here today for our natural selection lesson. So if you're in class today, we're doing a super fun activity where we go out in the schoolyard and we hunt for these things that we're calling woolly worms. We're basically pretending to be birds and we find these different colored yarns. We're going to come back to the classroom and collect some data and have a little discussion. If you're not with us today, we're just going to jump right into the lesson. So in our last lesson, we were introduced to Charles Darwin, who was a British naturalist that took a trip to the Galapagos Islands in the 1800s. And on this trip, he made tons of observations about plants and animals. And these observations really changed his way of thinking. So not only did this become something that changed his thinking, but it also generated more questions. So one of the things that he noticed on his trip was that species, or one of the things he thought prior to the trip was that species could not change. And of course, through things that he observed and fossil evidence, he very quickly changed his stance and came up with a new theory. So not only did this become a new theory for him, but he was able to collect evidence to support the idea that evolution does in fact occur. And so if you'll remember from the last lesson, evolution is a change in an organism's heritable traits over time. And so this led him to develop his theory of natural selection. So natural selection is just a mechanism by which individuals that have inherited beneficial adaptations survive and then produce more offspring with those adaptations. So basically, organisms with the best traits or adaptations will survive and, of course, reproduce. And we call this survival of the fittest. Darwin basically said that nature selects for certain traits. And so when parents create a variety of offspring, and we talked about this in the last lesson, so when you have offspring, there's variety within that offspring. Nature decides which of those variations gets to survive and of course reproduces, and then which do not. So a great example of this would be like with pesticide resistance over time. So let's say we have a colony of roaches, and so we can see like the DNA here. We see the blue allele is the way that the DNA of the roach is supposed to be, but we have one mutation. So one roach that has a mutated version of the DNA, and we've noted that with this red allele here. And we have a pesticide we're going to spray on this colony of roaches, and this pesticide is designed to target the alleles, the blue alleles in this particular picture, which it does. But this mutated version happens to survive this pesticide. And so what's going to happen here is this roach is going to survive and it's going to reproduce. And then we remember from genetics, if it survives and reproduces, it's going to pass along its traits. So what we might see in the next generation is we're going to see roaches that have that same mutated trait. We're going to see more of them. And so here again, we have some variation. Let's say we spray these roaches with pesticide that was the same pesticide from the first example. Of course, this pesticide is designed to kill roaches that have the non-mutated allele, and so it's going to do its job, but because we have an increasing number of the red allele roaches, they're going to survive. And so we're going to, if we go a third generation, we're going to see that the red allele is going to show up more, the blue allele is going to show up less, and so this creates a change over time in generations, which is known as evolution. So over multiple generations, organisms become more fit for survival and reproduction within their specific environments. A great example of this is with the peppered moth. If you're in class today, we're actually going to do a digital activity over this, but if you're not in class today, I'll give you a quick summary of how this relates to our natural selection lesson. So the peppered moth is a species of moth found in England. And there are two variations. So you can have light colored moths and dark colored moths. But in the 1800s, there were far more light colored moths. And the reason for this is because these peppered moths um, like to live in environments with light colored trees like birch trees. And so these light colored moths could easily blend into their surroundings. And of course, the dark colored moths could easily be seen by predators like birds. And so the dark colored moths would get picked off more easily. And so you had more light colored moths in the population, less dark colored moths in the population. But also in the 1800s, this was when the Industrial Revolution was firing up, and it was causing a lot of pollution from factories that were burning coal. And so the pollution, the soot and the ash, would just cover these light colored trees. And so it changed the color of the trees. And so now the dark colored moths were camouflaged, and the light colored moths suddenly were sticking out. And so their predators were noticing them and they were picking them off. And over time, what started to happen is the dark colored moths became more and more prevalent in the population because they were the ones that survived and reproduced. And of course, their dark traits became more frequent. So we're going to talk about, for the remainder of this lesson, there's 4 main principles to the theory of natural selection. So we're going to talk about how variation and overproduction and adaptation and descent with modification relate to natural selection. And we'll talk about some examples. So let's go through these 4 principles of natural selection. So the first one's variation. The heritable differences or variety that exist in every population is the basis for natural selection. So you can see when you have a population here of similar species or the same species, you're going to have naturally a little variation within the population. And so the differences among these individuals result from differences in, of course, the genome or the genetic material, genetic makeup of the organism. Another principle for natural selection is overproduction. So there's a struggle for survival, and this is because species tend to produce more offspring than the environment can sustain. And so because of this, we have something called competition. So when we have species that have more offspring than the environment can sustain, this raises the chance that some will survive, but it also generates competition between those offspring. Adaptation, we talked about this in the last lesson, but sometimes there's a certain variation that allows an individual to survive a little better than other individuals that it competes against, and so we call that an adaptation. And what happens is more successful individuals are naturally selected for, and they, of course, live longer. And then when they live longer, they reproduce. And when they reproduce offspring that share those adaptations. We also have descent with modification. We're going to talk about this a lot throughout this evolution unit, but over time, natural selection will result in species with adaptations that are well suited for survival and reproduction within an environment. And so more individuals will have a trait, or the trait will become more prevalent in every following generation, as long as environmental conditions continue to remain beneficial for that trait. And this is a great example if you want to take the time to pause the video and read the screen about the beetles, and suddenly their food supply is decreased because of a drought and what happens over time. At some point, you're going to have some practice where you have to showcase how the 4 principles of natural selection apply to a specific organism. So I wanted to provide you with an example here. And if you have a copy of my notes, you actually have this in your notes. So I did this on purpose because, again, eventually you're going to have a worksheet, and I'm going to give you some sort of scenario or organism, and you're going to have to tell me how that organism applies to the different principles of natural selection. We know that certain traits become more common in a population through the process of natural selection, but you can see here how a tiger is the perfect example of all 4 of these principles. So with tigers, we're going to produce several offspring. Not all of these offspring might survive. They're going to compete against one another for resources. Some of the resources might be scarce. Also, within the tiger population, you're going to have some variety, some variation. Some tigers might be born with really sharp teeth and really tough, large jaws, and some may not. And that's, again, just due to natural variation within a population. Of course, the tigers with larger jaws and teeth are going to be able to eat maybe something that tigers with smaller jaws and teeth are not able to eat. And so, of course, if they have that advantage or adaptation, these tigers are going to survive longer. They'll leave behind more offspring. And of course, the offspring will carry on their traits, which ties into descent with modification. So because larger teeth and jaws are heritable, they're going to become more common in the population over time because these are the tigers that are surviving. Natural selection acts on phenotypes, which are physical traits, if you'll remember from our heredity unit, rather than the genetic material itself. It's important to know that new alleles are not made by natural selection. They occur by genetic mutations. And I'm not going to expand on this a whole lot right now because we're going to talk about this in a whole lesson in the future. But also natural selection can act on traits that already exist. And so if you look here, we have a population of bacteria. And if within this population there's some sort of mutation that gives bacteria an advantage in a certain environment, then it's going to, of course, grow better than its non-mutated version. And so, of course, it's going to survive. It's going to increase in numbers because it's what we call selected for. A wonderful example of natural selection is the example of the finches from 1977. So in the Galapagos Islands around 1977, there was a drought that caused a sudden reduction of the number of soft seeds that finches were feeding on. So these small beaked finches in the Galapagos loved these small soft seeds. And of course, the drought got rid of those small soft seeds. And so there were still plenty of large tough-shelled seeds. So the finches that had these larger beaks that could break through those tough shells, they were thriving. So they were able to find food. Of course, they survived. And then the finches that couldn't break through those tough shells, of course, they died off. And so over time, over generations, we saw a change in the finch population. So the finches began to have this tough, larger beak. So a trait that was already in the population became favorable for survival because of a change in the environment, which we're going to see this a lot when we get to ecology, how a change in the environment can drive evolution or cause things to change as a result. As the environment changes, different traits will become more beneficial. And it's important to note that with evolution, a trait that is an advantage today might become a disadvantage in the future. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but this is what happens with antibiotic resistance. So we're going to come back to a future lesson where we talk about bacteria and antibiotic resistance and what that sort of generates as an issue today. So to end the lesson, here's a couple things you need to make sure that you jot down in your notes. It's important to know, I said this in the last lesson, but individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve over successive generations. Natural selection can amplify traits, but it can also diminish inheritable traits, like with the peppered moths and the finches with the tough beaks. Environmental factors can vary from place to place over time, and a trait that's favored in one place might be completely useless or even harmful in another place. All right, so this ends our lesson today. I will see you in the next lesson.